The bees are still here. That is the first thing a person notices, standing at the lip of this ravine in late October, when the cottonwoods have gone yellow and the limestone shelf above throws its long shadow across the frost-stiffened grass. Even now, even this late in the season, a few of them move, slow, deliberate, dropping down from somewhere in the canopy and threading their way through the bare-armed plum trees toward the hive boxes sitting in their crooked row along the south-facing bank. They do not hurry. They never did. That was always the truth about this place, the thing that took years to understand. Nothing here was rushed. Nothing here was accidental. A person stands at the ravine's edge and looks down, and the looking itself becomes a kind of remembering. It has been some years now since a young woman first pushed through the buckthorn along the dry creek bed and found what the bees had found before her. The brush is thinner today. She cleared most of it herself, over a long summer that left her hands so cracked and calloused she could not feel the pages of her ledger book when she turned them at night. The apple trees are taller, their trunks thickened to something respectable, and the grafted wood she coaxed onto the old wild rootstock has long since taken hold and forgotten it was ever anything but native to this soil. What had been tangled and abandoned and dismissed looks now, in the low autumn light, like something that was always intended to stand here. That is the particular cruelty of hindsight. It makes the improbable look inevitable. But it was not inevitable. Not by any measure the town would have accepted in the winter of 1890. She came to this county with $47, her father's entire worldly remainder, pressed into her hand by the county clerk in an envelope that smelled of cedar and old paper. She was young, and she was alone, and she had bought 65 ruined beehives with a portion of that money because a Bohemian beekeeper told her the surviving colonies were not finished, only frightened. The town did not agree. The town had considered the matter thoroughly and arrived at its verdict with the calm confidence of people who have watched hard winters take better prepared souls than hers. They were not unkind about it. That is important to say. They were simply certain. And she was simply quiet. She did not argue. She did not explain herself at the feed store, or at the assessor's window, or across the fence to the neighbors who paused in their own work to watch her haul salvaged lumber to the hive yard in February mud. She watched the bees instead. Every morning, before the dew was off the grass, she stood at the eastern fence line and watched where they went. Southwest, always. Into the brush, into the gully. Toward something. The bees do not fly toward nothing. She did not know yet what waited for her in this ravine. But she was beginning to believe there was something worth the finding. The winter that broke everything came without warning, as the worst ones do. January of 1891 arrived with a week of deceptive mildness, the kind that loosens a farmer's shoulders and makes him think the season has spent its anger. Then, on the 14th of the month, a front moved down from the Dakotas with a cold so absolute that it did not feel like weather so much as the withdrawal of something essential, warmth treated not as a presence but as a mercy, and the mercy simply gone. The temperature fell through the night and kept falling, and by dawn, the creek beds were iron, and the well ropes snapped when you pulled them, and the sound of the cold working through wood was like something alive inside the walls. The bees died in their thousands. Across the county, keeper after keeper walked to their hive yards in the gray light of that January morning and found silence where there should have been the faint interior murmur of clustered colonies holding their warmth. Some hives held a few survivors, clustered so tight and still they might have been a fist. Most held nothing but the cold geometry of empty comb. The old Bohemian beekeeper, who had worked his bees for 4 decades, walked his yard and counted what remained and made his arithmetic in the manner of a man who has suffered long enough not to weep over it. Of perhaps 200 colonies he had kept through December, fewer than a dozen showed any pulse of life come morning. He was not young, he was not rich. He made his decision quickly, as tired men do, and he stacked what he judged beyond recovery and burned them at the edge of the north field, the smoke rising gray and thin in air, so cold it barely moved. She watched the smoke from the road. She had been in the county only since the previous October, arrived after her father's death in the late autumn of 1890, which had left her with $47, a borrowed wagon, and no plan that anyone in town could make sense of. She had no family within 3 states. She had a quiet face and careful eyes and a habit of listening to older people that most younger ones had not yet learned to practice. She had heard about the Bohemian beekeeper through the minister's wife, who thought it a sad thing, all those hives ruined, and the old man too worn to start again. She had gone and introduced herself to him on a Thursday morning in early January, before the freeze, and she had listened to him talk about his bees for the better part of an hour. She had not yet known why. Now she watched his smoke. And something in her, not impulsive, not dramatic, but quiet and purposeful as water finding its way down, began to move toward a decision she could not yet have put into words. She had $47. She had nothing else but time and attention and a willingness to be thought foolish by people who knew better. She turned the wagon toward his yard. The old man was standing in his yard when she pulled the wagon in, and he did not seem surprised to see her. He had the look of a man who had already made peace with what he was letting go, a certain settled stillness in the shoulders, the way a field looks after the harvest has come and gone and there is nothing left to protect. The hives were arranged in 3 rows along the south fence, 65 of them, some leaning, some with their lids warped from freeze and thaw, the wood gone gray and soft in places where the winter had been unkind. A few had tipped entirely. She counted them twice from the wagon seat before she climbed down. There were others present that morning who had come, she understood later, for reasons of their own, curiosity, or the particular pleasure that assembles itself around a thing being sold at loss. The grain dealer from town stood near the fence with his hands in his coat pockets. The assessor's wife was there with another woman whose name she did not know. 2 neighboring farmers leaned against a post and spoke to one another in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the hives the way men look at a poor hand of cards. The old Bohemian named his price first, $20 for the lot. She said 18. He looked at her for a moment. She did not look away. He nodded, and that was all. No ceremony, no handshake theatrics, just the quiet concession of a man who understood what the hives were worth now and did not begrudge her the arithmetic. Behind her, she heard one of the farmers say something to the other that made them both exhale through their noses. Not laughter exactly, but the sound that sits just beside it. The assessor's wife did not bother to lower her voice when she spoke to her companion. 65 dead-out hives, and she's paying good money for them. There's a kind of sad bravery in that, I suppose. The grain dealer said nothing, but she saw him turn his head and study her in the way men study a transaction they expect to remember. She opened her ledger on the wagon board and wrote the date, January the 9th, 1891, and the amount, and the count of hives, and the name of the seller, and she did not look up while she wrote it. She did not look up because there was nothing in any of their faces that would add to what she already knew, which was very little, and nothing in their doubt that would subtract from it either. $18. 29 remained. She helped the old man load the hives into the wagon with a care that surprised him, she could see, lifting each one level, packing straw between them against the cold. He watched her hands. He did not speak until the last hive was loaded, and then he said something she would not understand the full weight of until the snow was gone and the first bees stirred. What the old man said she would carry with her through the long silence of that winter. But first, there was the matter of the land. The county tax sale was held in the cold anteroom of the courthouse on the 14th of January, 1891, 5 days after she had loaded the hives onto the wagon and driven them home through frozen ruts to a borrowed lean-to shed at the edge of a neighbor's field. She had wrapped each hive in burlap and banked them with straw and spoken no prayer over them because she did not yet know what to pray for. She had only the 9 that showed any faint sign, a dull clustered warmth when she pressed her palm against the wood, and the rest were as silent as stacked lumber. She arrived at the tax sale early and sat near the back with her ledger open on her knee. $29 remained of what her father had left. She had written that number in the column and underlined it once, a habit she had kept since girlhood, a way of making a fact hold still. The parcel came up third in the listing, 40 acres in the eastern township, described in the assessor's record as scrub and gully, bisected by a dry creek bed, carrying a stand of buckthorn and bindweed, unfit for cultivation. Assessed at 31 cents to the acre, a figure so low it had deterred even the most speculative buyers for 3 consecutive years running. The auctioneer read the description without inflection, the way a man reads a list of things already disposed of. She bid $29. No one countered. There was a pause that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and then the gavel came down, and the parcel was hers. She recorded it in the ledger on the same page. 40 acres, $29, January the 14th, 1891. Below that, she drew a single line, and below the line, she wrote the sum that remained. 0. She heard the assessor mention to the county clerk, as she rose to sign the transfer papers, that he supposed the young woman knew what she was doing. His tone made clear he supposed nothing of the kind. By the following week, the talk had shifted. The grain dealer's wife repeated what she had heard, that the orphaned girl had spent every cent of her inheritance on dead-out hives and gully land that wouldn't feed a goat. The banker at the corner table of the dry goods store said it was a pity, really. The father had been a steady enough man, and the girl had seemed sensible. Sensible until now. Old Mrs. Vopat, who kept a kitchen garden on the edge of town and was not unkind, said only that some losses come slower than others, and that she hoped the winter would not be cruel to the child. They were not malicious in their doubt. They were experienced. They had watched the land refuse good men for 20 years, and they had learned to read a failure before it fully declared itself. She went home and checked the hives and did not read their faces in her mind again. She had not asked him to come. That was the first thing she understood when she looked up from the third hive and saw the old man moving along the fence line with the slow, considered gait of someone who has walked rough ground so many times that the ground itself has stopped surprising him. He was her neighbor to the west, had been, she knew, for longer than she had been alive. He kept bees on his claim, 40 years of keeping, and his hives sat in a long row along a south-facing slope as orderly as a sentence written in careful hand. He had not introduced himself when she first came to the property. He had simply watched from a distance, the way a man watches weather. He came through the gap in the fence without asking and stood beside her at the third hive and looked at it for a long while. The cedar box was warped at one corner and the landing board had rotted through in the center, and she had propped it with a shingle she'd found in the grass. He studied the shingle. He studied the angle of the box. He did not offer his opinion of either. He moved to the next hive, and the next, lifting the corner of each lid only far enough to let the cold light in, then setting it back with a gentleness that seemed almost involuntary, the habit of a man who had handled fragile things for so long that care had become indistinguishable from instinct. She followed him and said nothing. She had learned, in the weeks since her father's death, that silence was a more useful instrument than she had once believed. At the 9th hive, the 9th of the ones that still held any life, he straightened his back and let out a breath that was not quite a sigh. He spoke in English that carried the shape of another language inside it, the vowels longer than an American mouth would make them, the consonants deliberate as a man setting fence posts. He said, "Bees do not fly toward nothing. Watch where they go each morning, before the dew is off the grass." That was all. He replaced the lid of the 9th hive and stood with his hands at his sides and looked out toward the ravine that cut through the back quarter of her acreage. The brushy gully she had not yet found reason to enter, choked as it was with buckthorn and the litter of 2 dry summers. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they already know the answer to. Then he walked back through the gap in the fence and up the slope toward his own claim, without looking back. She stood in the cold beside the 9 hives that were still alive out of 65 and considered what he had said. It was not advice, exactly. It was more like a direction given to someone who already knows the road but has not yet thought to start walking. She looked toward the ravine. She began to think about mornings. She began the watching on the 4th of February, 1891, when the temperature had not climbed above freezing in 11 days, and the light came up gray and thin over the eastern field, like something reluctant to arrive. She rose before full dawn, wrapped herself in her father's coat, too large at the shoulders, the wool smelling still of him, and walked to the eastern fence line with her ledger tucked under one arm and a stub of pencil in her coat pocket. She stood at the second post from the corner, which gave her a clear sight line across the dead grass to the hive yard, and she waited. The bees did not move in the coldest hours. They clustered inside their boxes in that slow-breathing mass that is not quite sleep and not quite waking, burning through the honey they had stored against exactly this kind of cold. She had learned enough by then to know they were not idle, that the cluster itself was a kind of labor, the outermost bees rotating inward so none froze at the edge, the whole colony turning like a slow wheel through the long nights. She had learned this from the old Bohemian, and she held the knowledge carefully, the way you hold something borrowed. But on mornings when the temperature lifted above freezing, which happened by late February, with increasing frequency, the bees came out. Not many at first, a handful from each of the 9 living colonies, cleansing flights mostly, brief sorties into the pale air. She watched the direction of each flight with the attention of a person reading a document they are not certain they fully understand. She did not guess. She noted. In the ledger, she drew a rough compass rose at the top of each page and made a small mark for each flight she could track before the bee disappeared against the colorless sky. Southwest. Always southwest. Not every single bee, for bees do not march in columns, but the preponderance, the drift of them, the way a stream has a current even when the surface looks still. Southwest, toward the brushy ravine that cut through the back quarter of her 40 acres. She recorded this for 6 weeks. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. In town, the murmuring had not stopped. She heard it in the way people hear things in small places, second-hand, arriving softened but intact. The woman who ran the dry goods counter told her, with the particular kindness of someone delivering bad news they consider necessary, that folks were saying it was a shame about the bees, that a young woman alone ought not to have put her whole inheritance into something that could die in a cold snap, that the land tax alone would eat her alive come autumn. She thanked the woman for the information. She bought a 1/4 pound of candle wax and a new pencil and walked home. That evening, she ruled a fresh page in the ledger. At the top she wrote the date, and below it, in her careful hand, she wrote the word. Southwest. Once more, and underlined it. The first week of April brought mud the color of iron rust, and she went in on a Tuesday morning before the light had fully settled, wearing her father's old boots with the left sole stitched back twice over and a wool coat that had seen better autumns. She carried nothing but the small notebook and a length of twine she had not yet found a use for, tucked into her coat pocket more out of habit than intention. The buckthorn was the first difficulty. It did not grow so much as conspire, low and lateral and threaded through itself, with thorns that caught wool and skin with equal indifference. She worked through it slowly, not forcing but finding, the way you learn to move through resistance when there is no one to watch you do it with any grace. Her hands were marked before she had gone 50 yards. She noted this without comment, even to herself. The dry creek bed was easier once she reached it, a pale cut through the scrub that the spring melt had not yet filled, its floor a mosaic of limestone pebble and old silt gone hard as fired clay. She followed it southwest, as the bees had followed it, though she did not fully understand yet that she was doing what they had done, tracing the same invisible logic through the same ground. The ravine deepened by degrees. The cottonwoods appeared first, older than she had expected, their trunks wider at the base than she could reach around, their bark furrowed deep as plowed rows. They blocked the north wind so completely that she felt the temperature change before she recognized what it was. A softness in the air, a degree or two of warmth that had no business being there in early April, held in the curve of the ravine like water in a cupped hand. Then she saw the overhang. Limestone, pale gray and streaked with old rain, jutting out from the ravine's western wall in a shelf perhaps 12 feet above the ground. It had sheltered this hollow for longer than anyone living could account for. The frost that had killed colonies across the county had broken itself against that stone shelf and the wall of old cottonwood. She stood still for a long moment, understanding this, the way you understand something that should have been obvious and wasn't. And then she saw the trees. 30 or more of them, crowded together in the sheltered floor of the ravine, their branches still winter bare but unmistakably shaped, the crooked reach of old apple, the close clustered twigs of plum, untended for years uncounted. Bark rough with lichen, crowns tangled where no hand had ever pruned them back, but alive, wholly, silently, stubbornly alive, standing in rows that were almost rows, the ghost of some earlier intention still visible in their spacing. She did not speak. There was no one to speak to, and the place seemed to require quiet the way a church requires it, not as a rule imposed, but as the natural response to something that has endured. She opened the notebook and began to count the trees. She counted 34 trees. She wrote the number in the notebook, then stood looking at what she had written as though the figure required time to become real. 34 trees in a forgotten ravine on 40 acres of land the county had assessed at less than $1 per acre. She did not yet know what to make of it. She only knew she would not leave without telling the old man. He came the following morning, moving through the buckthorn with the careful patience of someone who had learned long ago not to fight the land but to read it. She did not hurry him. When they reached the limestone shelf, she stopped and watched his face, and his face did something she had not expected. It went very still, the way a man's face goes when he is trying to decide whether he is remembering or seeing. He walked in among the trees without speaking. He moved from trunk to trunk, running his thumb along the bark, tilting his head to follow the angle of the old growth, bending once to cup a low branch in both hands and examine the bud scale at its tip. She stayed near the ravine's edge and let him work. The bees were already moving through the space between the crowns, unhurried in the cool morning air, and the old man watched them too, the way he always watched them, not tracking them exactly, but taking note of the ease in their movement, the lack of urgency that meant abundance rather than search. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. He said he knew who had planted these trees. A Czech homesteader, a man from the same region of Bohemia his own father had come from, who had filed a claim on this ground sometime around 1869, and had worked it for 2 or 3 seasons before the drought years stripped his hope away. He had abandoned the claim, and the land had gone back to the county, and no one had thought to note what the man had left behind him when he walked away. The county surveyor's chain had never reached this ravine. The assessor had never stood where she was standing. He said the overhang had done what the man could not have known to plan for. It had cut the north and west wind off the trees each winter, and the cottonwoods had thickened along the ravine's upper edge over the years, adding their own shelter to the stones. Every frost that had killed orchards on the open ground above had broken here before it reached the branches. For 20 years the trees had grown without pruning, without care, without anyone to harvest what they made, and they had made it anyway, season after season, dropping their fruit in the dark of the ravine where no one came. The bees had found them. he said simply. "The bees always find what has been left." He stood with his hands at his sides and looked up through the tangled crowns at the pale April sky, and she stood beside him and wrote nothing at all, because some things are not yet ready to be entered in a ledger. She did not stand long in the ravine that April morning before she understood that standing was a luxury she could not yet afford. There was the matter of the buckthorn. It had come in over the years as the orchard went untended, threading itself through the lower branches, driving its roots between the limestone shelves, armoring itself with thorns enough to draw blood through a leather glove. She began with it in the last week of April 1891, working from the ravine's eastern edge westward, pulling what she could pull and cutting what resisted pulling, carrying the brush out in bundles on her back, and burning it at the ravine's mouth, where the limestone opened onto the dry creek bed. She kept count of the days it took, 17. She kept count of the blisters, though she did not enter those in the ledger. The ledger held what could be counted in dollars. April 30th, 3 cents for a length of beeswax-soaked cloth to bind the grafts. May 4th, the scion wood arrived by rail from Omaha, wrapped in damp burlap inside a flat wooden crate, 17 varieties. The nurseryman had written on the enclosed card, suited to the climate of the Nebraska plain. She had spent $3.50 on that crate, which left her working funds slender enough to require careful arithmetic each week. She recorded it in the ledger and set the crate in the root cellar she had dug the previous autumn into the ravine's north bank, where the temperature held even and cool. The grafting took most of May. The mentor came 3 mornings and showed her the cut, showed her the angle, showed her how tight to bind the cloth strip and how loose, and then he went home and she continued alone. Of the 34 trees, she grafted 19 with improved apple stock, leaving the remaining wild trees to bear on their own rootstock, which he had told her was a kind of insurance a person would be grateful for in a dry year. She listened. She grafted. She bound each joint firmly and marked each tree with a small notch on the bark at knee height, and recorded the count in the ledger beside the date. June brought the work of the hives. The 9 living colonies had made it through April on what remained of their winter stores, and now the orchard's belated bloom, the wild plum first, then the apple, then the crabapple, was drawing them out in numbers that surprised her each morning. The mentor requeened the 2 strongest colonies himself, talking quietly while he worked, and she watched his hands and then requeened the next 2 herself under his eye. He corrected her once. Only once. By the end of June, she had 9 colonies that were building as though they meant to fill the whole of Nebraska with their work. She recorded that in the ledger too, though not in those words. The winter of 1891 came early and stayed long, and she did not resent it. She had learned by then to read the season's silences as instruction rather than opposition. The hives sat in their repaired rows along the eastern slope of the ravine's lip, sealed tight, and she checked them on the coldest mornings, not from worry, but from the same habit of accounting she brought to everything, a hand, laid briefly against the wood, to feel the faint warmth of cluster within, a mark in the ledger to confirm what she had found. 9 times she made that mark through December and into January. 9 times the warmth answered. She passed those months doing the smaller arithmetic of survival. She repaired the remaining hives, all 65 of the original frames cleaned, refitted, and painted with a thin coat of linseed oil against the damp, so that if the spring multiplied her colonies, as the mentor had promised it would, she would not be caught without vessels to receive them. She split no wood she did not need. She ate simply. She kept the ledger balanced to the cent. Spring came, in the way springs do on that land, not as a gift but as a negotiation, frost yielding ground by ground, creek bed softening from mud to something resembling soil. She walked the orchard for the first time since October, on a morning in late March, when the air still carried the cold, but the light had changed its angle, and what she found there stopped her mid-step. The grafted stock was showing green. Not all 19, not yet. 11 of the 19 grafts had broken dormancy by the first week of April. Small, tight buds no bigger than a shirt button, pale and cautious on the new wood. She stood among the trees and counted them with the same deliberate quiet she brought to the hive checks, touching each bud once and then withdrawing her hand, as though she feared the warmth of her fingers might presume too much. The mentor had told her that a graft does not declare itself until it is ready, and that trying to hurry the declaration was the surest way to lose it. She had believed him then. She believed him more completely now, standing in the ravine with 11 small proofs of his instruction distributed among the trees around her. The colonies came through winter with 8 living. She had braced herself to lose more. 8 was not 9, but the mentor looked at them in early April and told her, in his particular way of withholding praise only until it was earned, that 8 strong colonies going into a bloom year were worth more than 12 thin ones. By the end of May, she had split the 3 strongest and was tending 11. By August's end, 31 hives showed the yellow traffic of healthy work, and she wrote that number in the ledger slowly, deliberately, as a woman who had stopped holding her breath. The autumn of 1893 came in slowly, the way good autumns do in eastern Nebraska, a long, amber undoing of the summer's heat, the mornings sharpening by degrees, until the frost held past 8 o'clock, and the cottonwoods in the ravine went yellow all at once, as if by agreement. She began pulling honey in the second week of September, working methodically from the easternmost hive to the last, smoke and silence and the familiar weight of the supers as she lifted them clear. The mentor came 2 mornings to help her uncap the combs, his thick hands still practiced and sure, and they worked without much conversation, which was the way they had always worked best. When the counting was done, there were 31 crocks sealed and set in the root cellar, each one holding 12 pounds of amber honey that smelled of apple blossom and late clover, and something underneath that she could not name precisely, but had come to think of as the particular fragrance of the ravine itself, the limestone and the cold water that now ran faint and steady through the creek bed, as though the land had decided, at last, to stop withholding itself. 31 crocks, 372 pounds. She wrote the number in the ledger and sat with it a moment before she closed the cover. The fruit came off the trees the same week, 2 bushels of plum and nearly 4 of apple, more than the previous year by a third, the grafted stock having found its footing in the wild rootstock at last. She loaded it herself into the wagon, wrapped the more fragile plums in cloth, and drove to the county market on a Thursday morning when the light was still low and cold. She was not the first seller in from the county that day, nor the last. But by midday, her fruit was gone, and her honey crocks were down to 7, and a woman from the east side of town, the wife of the grain dealer who had once said, in the easy hearing of several neighbors, that she had paid good money for a graveyard, stood at her table for a long moment, looking at the remaining jars, with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite apology, but carried something of both. She did not speak to that woman, and the woman did not speak to her. There was no scene, no reckoning spoken aloud, but the looking was different now. That was what she noticed most, driving home with an empty wagon and a ledger entry that represented more than she had cleared in either of the 2 previous autumns combined. The town's eyes, when they found her, held something other than pity. It was not yet admiration. It had not yet settled into any shape she could hold in her hand, but it was no longer what it had been. He came in the second week of November, when the fields had gone the color of old straw, and the sky held that particular pale vacancy it takes on just before the first serious snow. She saw him from the kitchen window before he reached the gate, a man she recognized by his walk more than his face, the deliberate, slightly bowed step of someone who has spent 50 years leaning into work. He had sold her 65 hives for $18 and considered himself well rid of a misfortune. He had burned the worst of his own, rather than trouble with the moving. She did not hurry to the door, and he did not hurry to knock. He held his hat in both hands when she opened it. He said he had heard about the orchard. He said he was not too old to want good stock, and that he understood she had grafted onto the wild rootstock in the ravine, and that if she had cuttings to spare, he would pay fair for them. He named 50 cents apiece. She said she had 12 she could part with before the cold set in too deep. She did not say, "You sold me what you thought was ruin." She did not say, "You burned what you had given up on, and I rebuilt what you left behind." She said only that she would get them wrapped for travel, and she did. She cut 12 scions from the strongest of the wild apple stock, wrapped each in damp cloth and brown paper, and tied them with twine, the way the old Bohemian neighbor had shown her, snug, but not binding, with a little give for the long ride. He paid her $6 from a leather purse, and thanked her plainly, and she thanked him in return, because without the 65 hives, she would not have come to the ravine at all. This was true. She believed in the accuracy of that accounting. When he had gone, she opened the ledger on the kitchen table and entered the transaction in her careful hand. 12 grafting cuttings at 50 cents each, $6 received. She wrote the date. She closed the book. Then she walked out through the back field, past the repaired and repainted hives standing in their rows like a small quiet congregation, down through the buckthorn and the dry creek bed, to the edge of the ravine. The late clover was still working in the low sun, and the bees were still in it. Just a few, gleaning the last of what the season had to give. The limestone overhang caught the afternoon light and threw it warm against the old trees. The orchard breathed around her, patient as it had always been, waiting as it had always waited, holding what it held. She stood there for a long while. She did not need to write any of this down. She already knew what it was worth.